Aaron Sorkin, you know, if you're into movies, you know him as a screenwriter and also a showrunner. He did The West Wing and The Newsroom. The Newsroom came out when I was in college, and the Newsroom, I feel like, is very similar to this. While Newsroom, like, it did it with more recent things, it was all about, like, dispelling common misconceptions, where it was all about looking at certain events. You know, the Newsroom, it was all, like, around 2010, 2011, but looking at certain events of, like, how they actually happened, different from, like, how the news was reporting it at the time. Right. And this is very similar, and there is a scene in The Newsroom where they talk about the anti-war movement and kind of the trial of the Chicago 7, where they say these anti-war groups, you know, Tom Hayden and the Students for a Democratic Society, and, you know, Dave Dellinger with the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, along with several other groups, because while in the trial of the Chicago 7, the movie, they talk about these groups that were on trial, there was the protest at the 68 Democratic National Convention was actually a large amounts of groups, most of which, the members of which, were never put on trial. Right. But in The Newsroom, they mention how this image of the anti-war movement, while it was started as we're talking about progressive politics, and they didn't necessarily like look or dress like hippies or fit the part of hippies, it was kind of co-opted by this other group head by Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, and that's how people would view them. Right. For the rest of hippies as, you know, laying out into the field and Woodstock and getting high,
putting flowers in the guns,
and putting flowers in guns and trying to levitate the Pentagon, and that's how, you know, people would see them, and that's not accurate. That's not accurate to how the majority of the anti-war movement was. People need to realize that the hippie movement was a relatively small movement in this country, while Vietnam is one of the most unpopular wars we have ever fought. And
especially now, like, almost nobody agrees that was a good, even conservatives.
Yes. You know? And now looking back 50 years, we have 50 years now to look back. Pretty much everyone is on the same page that the anti-war movement was right. And the anti-war movement was a massive coalition, most of which were not dropping acid in the field.
It's just easy to, you know, pick that fucking bad, you know, the bad example to paint everyone with a broad brush, and then, you know.
But we look at, let's talk about the 1968 Democratic National Convention, because it's kind of similar to modern day politics, where
in a lot of ways
you have the front runner was Bobby Kennedy. Now, Bobby Kennedy was the more progressive of the candidates. He was in the lead because his brother was president and a lot of people liked him. He was against the war in Vietnam. And 2 months before the Democratic National Convention, that he's expected to get the nomination, he's assassinated in Los Angeles. So Herbert Humphrey, who wasn't particularly well liked, he, for a Democrat, was pretty conservative, gets the nomination. And you kind of see there's a real, it's a problem now, and it was a problem back then. It's really always been a problem for this country that we have a two-party system, where you have Herbert Humphrey and you have Richard Nixon, and then you have the progressive left.
Well, it's a two-party system, but one of the parties is split in two between, you know, a progressive movement and what you would consider now to be the Biden wing, you know,
what is establishment. Now, what was then the Bobby Kennedy, Herbert Humphrey, it would now be like the Bernie Sanders versus the Biden.
Right,
and
or the squad.
Or the squad.
Because, you know, Bernie.
Yeah. But
We'll see what he does, but
But you have a large group of people, the anti-war movement, who say these candidates do not represent, neither of these candidates represent us. So they hold this massive protest at Grant Park across from the convention center that is basically ambushed by the Chicago police. And later on, looking back, it is referred to what's called a police riot, where it's basically the police department committed widespread brutality because they were trying to incite a riot. Because
what are you talking about, Greg? They don't do that.
Because there were a group of people in Grant Park. They couldn't tell them to leave because it's against their First Amendment. They'd be breaking the First Amendment. So their option is to incite a riot to force them to leave.
Right.
And the Justice Department, under Lyndon B. Johnson, while investigating it, came to that same conclusion. And actually, before the Chicago 7 were arrested, I believe it was 8 police officers that were arrested. But then charges were later dropped. In the movie, they say they never sought out charges against them. But in reality, there were 8 police officers who they were going to put charges against for inciting this riot that they later dropped against because they realized that no one was going to go for this.
Who was gonna?
The Justice Department, basically the federal government.
But I'm surprised that they would do that because they were sort of working in cahoots with the police. At least that's the impression you.
That's the impression of the movie. I don't know. That's how it actually happened. I don't know.
So many parallels to today's society too. It's really upsetting when you watch these things and you go like, this was 50 years ago, but it could have been this summer.
Exactly. So after the riots happened, these 7 men were arrested, and then an 8th man, Bobby Seale, was kind of put on later. There's Tom Hayden and Remy Davis, who represent this group called the Students for a Democratic Society, or the SDS. There's Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, who represent the Youth International Party, which would be considered like the hippies. They called themselves the Yippies, like the young hippies. And then David Dellinger, who had been a pacifist and kind of an anti-war activist since World War II. He was one of like the first heads of like the American Socialist League. And he created the National Committee, the National Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam. And then there are 2 others who were there, but they weren't really like associated with any group. John Froines and Lee Weiner, who were kind of, they say it in the movie, like they're put in so that the jury can find them innocent and not feel as bad about finding everybody. They're called the givebacks, where basically you get a bunch of people that, the charges against them are flimsy, and then you have 2 people that are clearly innocent, so that the jury can find them innocent and not feel as bad about finding the other guys guilty.
They have that. There's a term in show business where, like, when you're pitching something, like you put things into the pitch that that the network is going to strike down.
Right.
So that you feel like, hey, I made these concessions.
Yeah.
Meanwhile,
Exactly. And then later, Bobby Seale, who is the head of the Black Panther for Self-Defense Party, is thrown in, and Bobby Seale had left Chicago before the riots ever happened. He was only in Chicago for 4 hours. He was there. He made a speech. He wasn't even supposed to be making the speech. A different Black Panther was supposed to be making a speech, who ended up not being able to make it. And Bobby Seale kind of did it at the last minute. He goes there, he makes the speech, he leaves Chicago, then the riot happens, and then he's arrested, and he's put on trial with the rest of the men. And basically, the entire reason he was put on was because they thought this jury will convict them. If we put a black man with these white people, it will be easier for a jury to convict them.
Yeah, and then especially if they're seeing Black Panthers sitting in the
and especially if you're seeing Black Panthers sitting in the, sitting in the audience.